Right now, oil prices are spiking and stock markets are rattled, all because of a single sentence about a ceasefire with Iran. But to understand why that sentence moved global energy markets so violently, you need to understand the engine running underneath it: economic sanctions. What they actually are, how they work, why sometimes they succeed, and why, according to researchers, they fail more often than most people realize. Let's start at the beginning. An economic sanction, in the simplest terms, is when one country uses its economic power to cut off or threaten to cut off another country, entity, or individual from access to financial systems, trade, and investment. They are designed as an alternative to military force, pressure a government to change its behavior without firing a single shot. According to researchers, sanctions are typically used instead of military attack, intended to prevent aggression between countries and bring about a change in policy. The United States is by far the most prolific user of sanctions in the world. The agency responsible is the Office of Foreign Assets Control, known as OFAC, which sits inside the Treasury Department. OFAC administers dozens of different sanctions programs, from broad country-level embargoes to targeted designations against individual people and companies. The tool is blunt or surgical, depending on how it is deployed. Comprehensive sanctions, which function as near-total economic embargoes, prohibit almost all trade, financial transactions, and investment between American entities and the sanctioned nation. Countries currently facing these kinds of sweeping restrictions include Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and Syria. Then there are sectoral sanctions, which target specific industries like energy or banking, and then targeted sanctions, which freeze the assets of specific named individuals and companies, barring them from doing business with anyone in the U.S. financial system. But here's where it gets more powerful and more controversial. There are two layers to American sanctions. The first layer, called primary sanctions, applies directly to U.S. persons and U.S.-connected transactions. Primary sanctions prohibit American citizens and organizations from doing business or completing transactions with any entity that OFAC has designated. The second layer is called secondary sanctions. These reach beyond American borders entirely. Secondary sanctions authorize the Treasury or the State Department to threaten sanctions against non-American companies and individuals for doing business with a sanctioned target, even if that business has no U.S. connection whatsoever. In effect, the United States is telling foreign companies, do business with this sanctioned country, and we will cut you off from American banks and American markets. That threat is extraordinarily powerful because so much of global commerce is settled in U.S. dollars, which means it almost inevitably passes through the American financial system at some point. The most dramatic financial weapon in the sanctions toolkit is access to SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. SWIFT is a secure messaging network that connects over 11,000 financial institutions in more than 200 countries, handling around 44 million messages per day. It does not move money itself, but it is the communication layer that makes international bank transfers possible. Cutting a country off from SWIFT is like cutting its banks off from the global phone network. When Iranian banks were disconnected from SWIFT in 2012, it delivered an immediate shock to Iran's oil revenues. When selected Russian banks were cut off following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the ruble plunged more than 30% in the weeks that followed, with immediate capital flight and market volatility. Now let us look at Iran specifically, because it is the country at the center of the breaking news this week, and it represents the most layered, longest-running sanctions regime in history. American sanctions against Iran go back to November 1979, imposed after radical students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took hostages. Those initial sanctions froze roughly $8.1 billion in Iranian assets. They were lifted, then reimposed, then progressively expanded over the following 4 decades. Iran was the most heavily sanctioned country in the world until Russia surpassed it following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. The most significant development came in 2015 with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, widely known as the JCPOA or the Iran nuclear deal. Iran agreed to verified limits on its nuclear program. In exchange, most United Nations and multilateral sanctions were lifted. That agreement was described by officials at the time as proof that sustained economic pressure could produce diplomatic outcomes. But in 2018, the United States withdrew from the JCPOA and reimposed and expanded American sanctions, arguing that the deal's restrictions were too limited in scope and duration. The following years brought wave after wave of additional pressure. The U.S. Treasury designated oil companies, tankers, banks, front companies, and individuals across multiple countries for facilitating Iranian oil exports. According to the State Department's own records, sanctions actions against Iran's oil network were issued virtually every month through 2025, targeting everyone from Chinese independent refineries, so-called teapot refineries, to shadow banking networks laundering billions of dollars in oil revenue. Over 460 non-Iranian persons, including companies and individuals in China, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and Hong Kong, were designated under Iran authorities in 2025 alone. Then, in August 2025, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom triggered what is known as a snapback mechanism, a provision built into the original 2015 nuclear deal, allowing any participant to reimpose United Nations Security Council sanctions. The snapback process concluded on September 27, 2025, when the United Nations officially reimposed sanctions pursuant to 6 Security Council resolutions. Those restored resolutions required Iran to suspend uranium enrichment activities, prohibited the use of ballistic missile technology, reimposed travel bans and global asset freezes, and authorized the seizure of prohibited cargo being transferred by Iran. So with all of this pressure, decades of sanctions, snapback mechanisms, secondary designations, banking restrictions, did it work? The answer, according to researchers and analysts across the political spectrum, is complicated. The consensus in academic literature is that conventional trade and financial sanctions result in some meaningful behavioral change in the targeted country only about 40% of the time. More targeted sanctions, bans on luxury goods, sectoral restrictions, have an even lower success rate, closer to 20%. Researchers have found that sanctions work best against friendly or neutral countries and have a significantly lower success rate, closer to 19%, against openly hostile ones. On Iran, the record is mixed by any measure. U.S. sanctions have adversely affected Iran's economy, according to Congressional Research Service analysis. The Iranian rial collapsed, inflation surged, and protests erupted in late 2025, triggered in part by the economic crisis. The reimposition of UN and U.S. sanctions contributed directly to Iran's currency instability, according to statements from U.S. Treasury officials. Yet, despite those economic costs, Iranian government behavior continued to be characterized as a threat to U.S. interests. Iran's leaders responded to decades of sanctions by developing what they called a resistance economy, deliberately reducing dependence on Western financial systems, deepening ties with China and Russia, and building elaborate evasion networks. And that brings us to one of the most consequential developments in global sanctions enforcement, the shadow fleet. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 triggered what analysts describe as one of history's most comprehensive and coordinated sanctions campaigns, sweeping banking restrictions, swift disconnections, an oil price cap, and asset freezes totaling roughly $285 billion in frozen Russian central bank reserves held in G7 jurisdictions. But Russia built a parallel shipping system to keep its oil exports flowing. Approximately 1,400 vessels, using methods including GPS spoofing, ship-to-ship transfers at sea, false flag registrations, and shell company ownership, moved roughly 6 to 7% of global crude oil flows while evading the Western price cap regime. According to analysis from the Kiev School of Economics, the shadow fleet generated about $9.4 billion in additional revenue for Russia in 2024. Despite the sanctions regime imposed by the EU, the United States, and the G7, Moscow's oil revenues actually increased approximately 5% from 2023 to 2024. The mechanics of shadow fleet evasion reveal just how adaptive sanctioned states have become. Vessels change their country of registration, their flag, frequently. When Western pressure forced Panama, the Marshall Islands, and Liberia to stop registering shadow fleet vessels, the tankers moved to Cameroon, Gabon, Palau, the Comoros, and other registries with minimal oversight. More than 300 shadow fleet tankers shifted to fraudulent flags in 2025 alone. As soon as one vessel is sanctioned, another joins the fleet. As soon as one company is designated, a new one is created, sometimes at the same address. As of the third quarter of 2025, more than 1,900 dark fleet vessels were identified as operating globally, with the beneficial ownership of roughly 60% of them remaining unknown to enforcement authorities. The European Union, by late 2025, had sanctioned over 600 individual vessels. The United States seized 7 tankers and approximately 7 million barrels of Iranian crude between December 2025 and February 2026, described as the largest enforcement action in years. But analysts noted that 7 seized vessels against a fleet of nearly 2,000 means sanctioned operators need only absorb a fraction of a percent in annual seizure losses. The Kiel Institute published analysis in July 2025, concluding that sanctions do work, but not all countries are affected equally. Developing countries with undiversified export structures are particularly vulnerable. Countries with strong external partners, alternative financial rails, and commodity wealth are more resilient. The Center for Strategic and International Studies has warned that excessive reliance on sanctions risks fostering resistance, incentivizing adversaries to develop workarounds that dilute their impact. This brings us back to this week. On July 8, 2026, following Iranian attacks on 3 commercial vessels in the Strait of Hormuz and subsequent U.S. strikes, markets were jolted when the ceasefire with Iran was declared over. Brent crude jumped over 5%, briefly touching $80 a barrel. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 577 points. The U.S. Treasury simultaneously revoked a sanctions waiver that had temporarily allowed Iranian oil to be sold into global markets as part of a memorandum of understanding signed in mid-June. The speed and scale of the market reaction illustrates exactly what is at stake. The Strait of Hormuz is the choke point through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply passes, and the question of whether sanctions or diplomacy or military force can bring stability to that corridor has direct consequences for energy prices, inflation, and economic conditions globally. What to watch for next, whether formal negotiations resume, and whether the sanctions waiver gets reinstated. 2 decisions that analysts say will determine whether oil markets stabilize or face another major repricing. The broader question for the coming months is whether the U.S. and its allies can tighten sanctions enforcement against the shadow fleet infrastructure, or whether the adaptive networks built by sanctioned states have permanently changed the ceiling on what economic pressure alone can achieve. If you want to follow this story as it develops, subscribe to this channel. We cover the major global economic and geopolitical stories every single day.